it was the informal. I mean, the reality is, you know, there's really valuable customers for software vendors, Citigroup, you know, Liberty Mutual, whoever, and somebody informally may give them that information.
Right, and I'll assert again what I said in the private session. If that happens in my company, I want to trace it all the way back to the source and introduce them to new career opportunities. So they can enjoy an increasing stock price.
Interesting. So,
yeah, nice. It's 408. It's 408.
If you want to be on John's deferred list, there'll be a list in the back to sign up for.
While John's answering his cell phone, let me just say that our practices are essentially the same as Cisco's in that regard. We don't have a preferential list, and we don't patch our IT systems. We would. I don't think we've ever had it happen. We would patch Windows Update preferentially if we had to, for the obvious reason. But it's just too darn hard for practically or ethically or anything else to figure out where you draw that line. You wind up, everybody has a compelling reason to be on the list of people who get to go to the head of the list. And
that is one of the most powerful things that we tell our customers is when they understand that our internal networks are not on a preferential list, are not getting patched ahead of them getting the patch. It really does, as John said, we're in the same boat as our customers.
Yeah, but apparently I can call my own cell phone number and get on the list, so that's good news.
So I think it goes back to preferential lists, and you mentioned, you know, identifying some organizations or corporations that would, I don't want to use the word preferential, but would be made aware of the situation prior to others. And in those situations, I would see that which provides the service that you need in order to push the patches or give that, right? So like an internet service provider, you would need them perhaps to assist you, and they would be made aware of the vulnerability that exists so that they could, one, patch, and two, push to the rest of the world. Is that, right. Is that the assumption that we're making?
It is, and in fact, you always know when it happens,
right,
because you just look at the peering points reset, and you pretty much assume that we're doing something.
Right, and I was on both sides of that.
Hidden.
Working for an ISP previously, as Josh Fritz, who's over there in the corner, did as well, which was something that gets you back to, it gets out. So when we at the ISP that I worked for knew about it, we were perceived as being on a preferential list, which does not exist. I'm by no means trying to defend any of the vendors here, but the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes you do have preferred releases just to support the rest of the community, which in my world makes sense. Even though I'm not in the ISP world anymore, I certainly want them to be able to sustain it when I need it to download it.
But that only touches on the vendor aspect. And I know, we talk, obviously we know what iDefense's policy is. There's a lot of companies that actually are in the business of buying vulnerabilities. One of our questions was, at what point do they notify the vendor? Essentially their customer base is a preferred list. So, people subscribe to these services to get that advance warning. And I'd be interested just in also general comments from the audience along those lines.
That's a paid-for service, though. It's totally different.
I'd like to offer up one point, though, that I think was subtly messaged a minute ago, which is I'll just use my own company. Somebody says, I told Cisco a year ago. Okay, who in Cisco is a key part. I love my salespeople to death as long as they keep making revenue and bookings. However, they may not be the right and most qualified person to understand the very technical thing that you just told them in order to relay it over to the right group of people. So the earlier comment about RFC standards and who to contact, I think that's really, really, really important, which is you gotta have a consistent technique as a vendor by which to hear that information, and absent that being used, you're right, you did tell Cisco, but Cisco is 48,000 people, and you might not have told the CERT, which is our incident response team, and that's the only group that you should have told.
Yeah,
so
and
that's really important too.
I brought it up this morning that I think that in this process, there are obligations that the vendor has, and there are obligations that the researcher has. And I think that a really important obligation that the vendor has is to make it easy to get that information and have a consistent process and a team dedicated to it. And I mean, fortunately now, most of the big companies do, not all companies do, which is a huge change from, say, 5 years ago. But that is a fundamental obligation on the part of the vendor, is to make sure that there is a process in place.
You in the back there standing up with the black t-shirt. Could you speak up a little, please?
Yeah, we did talk about that this morning, and one of the things that I sort of shook my fist at the vendors for in a kind, polite, loving way was that it's important to have that honesty so that people can make their own risk assessments, can know when a patch is really important to roll out. One of the major failures last summer was that there was a patch out for the Cisco Gate stuff, and no one knew it was important, no one installed it, and so all of a sudden, boom, in 2 weeks, everyone is scrambling to upgrade the whole internet because, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Well, at least something with the patch to say, hey, this is...
They should have a workable communication method with their customers. Whatever their standard method of communicating with their customers is, I believe that they ought to have one, and they ought to make it known that their customers who are going to pay attention to security know how to get that information.
Who doesn't give you Microsoft to tell you what the updates are going to be? If you know how to get software, everyone will have. Right next to a piece of software is a defense software releasing it. If the customer doesn't need to release it, that's the vendor.
Okay.
Right, yeah. I mean,
We
I
had
think,
a question over here on the left. Yes, you. Okay. Excuse me, we have a question over here on the left. Could you please stop or leave the room?
My question is actually about preferential treatment, and I think it's actually slightly different for packet transport, like network equipment providers. But like Cisco, are you saying that there's not an idea of something like a skid or core, where a group of backbone providers you notify before all others because they have to provide the infrastructure for everyone to upgrade their devices?
You're absolutely right, except in the circumstance that that network infrastructure in a very, very tightly controlled process that we go through would actually be completely at risk. So for example, many of the vulnerabilities we release affect ISPs, but will it actually destabilize their core every single time? No, mostly because of everything from for example, the fact that you've got multi-redundant pathing throughout the internet, to the fact that we're not the only vendor on the internet, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you take something like TCP/IP, the v4 wedge problem, or the SNMP, vulnerabilities back in the ASN1 days, that can affect multiple vendors, which would affect then all paths, and then we run into a very different problem, which is now we're all in a position where we're going to have to actually take care of the infrastructure. To your point, absent that though, no. And by the way, some of the largest customers we have don't exactly like hearing at the same time as the smallest customers. But we figure that as soon as there's a preferred list, everybody will get signed up onto it. By the way, 405-555-1212. And then there's no preferred list again. So it's just a deathly cycle to get into.
But like with the TCP windows, slipping something in a TCP window, right? And so everyone should enable TCP MD5, for example. And the select core providers were notified of that that vulnerability, and they start enabling this and resetting sessions, and it's visible to everyone else. And they're saying, oh, there's some problem with TCP and BDP, and so they decide whether they should upgrade or what they should do without enough information.
Well, and you'll notice that that window was, I think, I'd have to quote Russ, but it's probably something like 48 hours before the information's out anyway. So the window is exceedingly small. And that's part of that process that we go through, which, by the way, is the hardest one for us to go through, is when to do it. And it's also with the assurance that the information is going to be public very quickly. In fact, many times in concert, because it's multi-vendor, if not as a subjugate to what U.S. CERT's announcement schedule will be for it, because it is a multi-vendor problem of which we are just one, and it does us no good for Cisco to come out and go, hi, we fixed this multi-vendor problem first, and now Juniper just learned about it. I mean, in public press. I mean, that's just, that'd be an awful thing for us to go through, and we won't do it. So.
Okay, we have about, I think, 5 more minutes. So we're going to take 1 or 2 more questions over here.
One real quick question. Will U.S. CERT go on the record and comment if they share their information with anyone, and if so, who?
So I take it you're not one of our subscribers then. did you take that first step and actually sign up?
That was pretty good.
So no, I mean, we do, we have the technical and non-technical cyber alerts, and we do have a number of vehicles for getting access to that information. So, I'm
Previous to the public advisories.
you're talking about pre-disclosure?
Yes.
Again, if we're seeing, active exploitation, or we see something and the vendor might not have the patch fully baked, or it might not be where it needs to be, we're going to go ahead and communicate that. So, but we're going to let the vendor know that we're going to do that, so they can, take the appropriate steps. As you heard, Steve touch on, sometimes they have a patch that's ready to go. It's not fully tested. But again, that also helps grease the skids and moves the vendor along a little bit faster too when we give them that notification. But we are actively looking to see if there is activity related to a vulnerability.
And more specifically, someone reports a vulnerability to you rather than the vendor. Do you share that with anyone besides the vendor up until the disclosure point?
It's one of those, it depends. So, again, we have, so basically, when we get something, we're going to quickly take a look, from a national security and a homeland security perspective. And basically, this is our own triage, so I'll get to that. But basically, we've got sources to also take a look and see, are we seeing any related activity? Of course, we're going to do some validation, and we're going to be working very closely with the vendor right off the get-go, because we also need their help to help validate this. And I know in a lot of instances where we worked with the vendor, based on what a security researcher found, they might find one angle or one vector, and it's actually, obviously to a bigger problem or a bigger issue, or there's another way to take advantage of a vulnerability. So, I mean, there's a lot of steps that come into play.
So if I report something to U.S. CERT, where's it going besides the vendor?
I don't know if you could hear Tom's question. Oh, yeah.
Okay, the question was, where else does it go aside from U.S. CERT if you report something to U.S. CERT?
Besides the vendor. So, again, back to all this discussion we just had on disclosure, we're working very closely with the vendor. At the same time, we're also trying to pay attention to what's out there. We're very concerned about leaking the information ourselves, because we don't want to create the problem of exploit tools and things being developed.
So to nobody besides the vendor.
Right. Within, we've got a small government circle of folks that we work with as well, so pretty much.
See,
It's back to the it depends. So, I mean, there's a number,
that's really interesting, because it seems there's a lot of hostility
we're gonna get a recursive loop
towards,
on that, so.
Giving it to, from a US perspective, giving it to government organizations, and then, feeding it within that government-like area. In the UK, I've got no problem with that. If I find a bug, the first person I tell about is CSG and NICE in the UK kind of thing, because my own independent security relies on national security, and that means I'll give this information to, the powers that be in Britain, It seems like there is a divide, well, obviously other than the ocean, between the way we see these things, So.
Well, I don't really.
Would you give it to the U.S. government, though?
Yes, I'm quite happy
at the same
to do.
time as
yeah,
UK?
I'm quite happy to do that, and we do that.
Would you give it to the Indian government, French? I mean, you see,
Western
South
interests,
Korea?
Western interests, mate.
Okay. No, I was just.